Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for another very special edition of WOWSA Live with our host, Ned Dennison. Ned?
Hello, everyone. I'm the chairperson of the International Marathon Swimming Hall of Fame. We have an author as our guest today. He's written a great book about one of our honorees, Jim Doty. Bob McCormack, will you say hello to everyone?
Hello, how are you?
Let me give everybody just a high-level overview of Jim Doty's career. He swam the length of most New Hampshire lakes, the coastline from south of Boston up to Maine, and he was also in the World Professional Marathon Circuit and raced in Chicago, Quebec, Rhode Island, made a couple of English Channel attempts, and he was the first person to swim 23 miles around Cape Ann, 18 miles from South Boston to Graves Light, 17 miles from Nantasket Beach around Graves Light into Revere, et cetera, et cetera. He did a lot of great swims. He also established the International Marathon Swimming Hall of Fame David's Wheeler Award. It's actually from the International Swimming Hall of Fame, but we've been given the honor of selecting each year. And he restarted the Boston Light in 1978. He founded the New England Marathon Swimming Association that same year as a charity organization. And he's literally been a leading light in that part of the world for us. Bob, can you tell us a bit about your swimming experience and how that came together with Jim Doty?
I became interested in ocean swimming way back, probably around 1963-ish. And I started going down to L Street in South Boston. And I would watch this person, two people actually, going back and forth and back and forth. And the water was rough down there. It's pretty much, almost like open ocean. And there are two fences at L Street, 1/8 of a mile apart. And these people, no matter when you'd go down, you'd see these two guys going back and forth. And one of them was Jim Doty. And the other was a good friend of his, Dr. Joel Saperstein, and they worked out regularly down there. And it really got me encouraged to try it also. So, and then I started swimming swimming the fences down there. And I found that I could, swim quite a few fences also. You have to work your way up to it naturally, but that's how I got interested in it. Watching Jim every day.
In your book, there's a great story about how Jim kind of got either back into swimming or into open water swimming. It involves a guy named Jack Starrett. Can you tell us a little bit about Jack and that meeting and how that all came about?
Jim, when he got out of college, he graduated Harvard, I believe it was 1959. And he was a weight man in college. He beefed up in order to be, throw the shot put and the hammer throw. And he was very good at that. He became #1 in New England while he was, not in New England, but in the Ivy League. But after he got out, he started to put on weight. So he wanted to lose some weight. So he used to meet his mother down at the Wayland Beach. And while he was down there, he saw this person going back and forth, just as I had seen Jim later. And that person was Jack Starrett. That was the early 60s, maybe 61, 62. And he became acquainted with Jack. And it turned out that Jack was a great swimmer and also had cerebral palsy. And he and Jim started, and he tutored Jim actually, and told him that he encouraged Jim in the early days. And it turned out that Jack went over to England and he swam the English Channel himself. And I talked to him about that time also. And I said, how does one swim the English Channel? And he says, you have to learn to swim endlessly. You just keep swimming. I started thinking going all my life, and but that was it. That was his advice. Just keep swimming endlessly. But he was really a character, and he and Jim formed a very fast friendship and participated in quite a few swims together, professionally and non-professionally.
Your story got me back doing some research. The International Marathon Swimming Hall of Fame has a formal initiative on recognizing and encouraging disabled folks. And we went back, and one of our honorees, Gertrude Ederle, who's everyone heard of, was deaf. Another honoree, Ernest Vierkaufer, had one working eye. They both did the English Channel, but Jack was the first one. So he'd have been the third disabled person, but the first one with a body disability. It sounds just an absolutely inspiring guy. Bob, tell us a little bit about the geography of Boston Harbor, because when I read your book, it's this island, that island, this island, that island. Yeah, how many islands are there out there?
There are maybe 30 islands in Boston Harbor. And when the tide comes in on the inner part, on the side of the islands, between the islands and the mainland, the tide rushes in because it's kind of a funnel effect. It rushes in, but and it goes around the islands, and there's all kinds of cross currents and all kinds of back eddies. If you get too close to an island swimming, you're gonna be fighting the current instead of going with it. So you would think in a swim like the Boston Light, which starts in Hull, Mass, at the Boston Light and goes, I think it's west into, toward Boston, northwest. You would think that the tide would be a big help, and it is somewhat of a help, but it's really offset by the fact that you sometimes you're swimming against cross currents, sometimes you're swimming against the current if you're too close to an island. So in the old days, the swimmers in Boston Light used to go the 12-mile route, and they go the outer route. They go on the other side of the islands, along a route that they call President Roads. And that was a 12-mile swim in those days, but you're better off out there, actually, because you don't have the island cross currents to contend with. But it's a tough swim, and there are a lot of islands out there, and you don't realize it until you start swimming the Boston Light and the areas out in that area there.
When people talk to me, they sometimes ask me, what's the swim I'm most proud of? So I'll ask you, what was the swim that Jim was most proud of?
I'm gonna say, when I interviewed him and I spoke with him also, I think the Cape Ann swim was his proudest swim. It was actually a swim that Jack Starrett thought of. It was up in Gloucester, and it's open ocean completely, practically, and the 23-mile swim. And Jack came up with the idea of he and Jim swimming it and being the first ones to ever do it. This was way back in the 60s, and probably 68, something like that. And so he and Jim went up there, and they started, and Cape Ann is a peninsula. So they started off at a beach called Wingasheek Beach in Gloucester. And the idea was to swim out to the open ocean, adjacent to the peninsula, the north side of Cape Ann, and go up and around the point up there. I think it's Point Andrew, and then come back the other way on the other side of the peninsula. So you have the advantage, at least, of seeing the shore all the time, because you're going adjacent to the shore of Cape Ann, but it is complete open ocean, and the conditions are always choppy and rough up there and windy. But this first time, they went around the tip and came back along the south side of Cape Ann, and they probably did 18 miles, and they got into a huge oil slick, and the two of them got sick and couldn't continue. They had to get out. They probably had 5-6 miles to go, but they had to get out. And it was very disappointing, especially to Jack. He wanted to make that swim in the worst way. But then Jim went up maybe a year or two later, 2 years later, to try it solo. And he maybe got, 5 hours into the swim, and the water was 52 degrees. So, and that's cold, and it really got into his bones. So he got out. But he was not one to give up easily. He went back again, probably 4 or 5 years later in 1973, solo. And he went into the water at Wingashik Beach. It was a nice, calm day, calmish, as calm as it gets out there. And he went up and around Point Andrew, came back down the other way. He got into a channel on the other side, on the south side of Cape Ann, and there's an island. I guess it's an island. It's a long piece of land, goes between there and the mainland of Cape Ann, and it's a channel in there, and it gave him a good push. So he got down through the channel. The only problem was a lot of pleasure boats in there, kicking up water, going too close to Jim. The boat, Jim said to the boatman, "Get him out of here, get him out of here." And the boatman was waving them away, but the more he waved them away, the closer they came, because they were harassing him, in other words. But Jim persevered, got to the end of that channel, and made it all after dark. It was maybe a 12-hour swim. After dark, he's touched land over on the other side, and that was it. He was first, and as far as we know, the only one to ever complete that tough swim, 23 miles open ocean. I think that was his proudest swim.
So Bob, one of the things that I remember distinctly as a kid was, you didn't get in city rivers. They were dirty. Yeah. And now I'm a half a century plus older, and I occasionally hear a swimmer talk about the water wasn't clean, this, that, whatever. You're a guy from the Boston area. In your book, you talk about this oil slick. You talk about a patch of raw sewage. What kind of changes in the water quality have you seen in the last few decades?
Oh, I've seen quite a bit of quite an improvement. And I would credit Jim and his the people that he worked with. He was active in an organization called Save Our Shores, and another active participant in that was a woman called Louise Day Hicks. She was on the school committee for years in Boston, and then she was running for mayor on this particular year. So she was trying to get publicity, but at the same time doing good for the people. And so Jim was a member of that, and the harbor was in horrible condition. So to highlight that, Jim and his good friend Dr. Joel Saperstein were going to do a swim from South Boston Yacht Club out to Graves Light, so maybe a 10-mile swim, just to highlight the conditions of the harbor. So Louise Day Hicks was one of the spectators. She was on the shore with her signs, and Jim and Joel dove in. No, wait a minute. They didn't dive in. They took the boat out to Graves Light, and they turned around and they swam back in, but they gave maybe within 3 miles of the shore, and they hit raw sewage. This was fairly common. It was very common, really, in those days, because the sewer treatment plant was right there on shore, or maybe on an island very close to the shore. I think it was Moon Island. And when you get to, certain weather conditions, the sewer treatment plant would fill up and overfill, and then the sewage started coming into the harbor. And that's what happened. Joel and Jim hit the sewage. They got sick. They had to get out. They couldn't finish the swim, but they rowed the boat the rest of the way in, and Jim never wanted to keep anything in. He was always pretty frank about when he was talking. He told Louise Day Hicks what had happened, and he's spouting off. And next day in the papers, highlighted harbor conditions, horrible, awful. So they started cleaning it up, I think, right about that time. And Jim Joel went back again a couple of months later and did the same swim and found the harbor conditions not pristine, but better. So they came all the way in and they reported that conditions were better. And then the following year, Jim went out by himself, and no, he went with the Jack and Joel again, but Jim intended to do the swim round trip. So he went out to Graves Light. He swam from the mainland to Graves Light and back. So a distance of about 20 miles. Jack Starrett was with him, but Jack got into the boat after the one-way trip, which he had intended to do all along. Joel kept going. He swam another 5 miles to Revere. But Jim did the round trip, but he said the water conditions and the harbor conditions were a lot better. He didn't see any open sewage or anything in the harbor. So
For the swimmers of today that complain about a small patch of sweet water, there's a big difference between a small patch of sweet water and a major sewage outfall. Bob, Jim, like many of our honorees, had a visit or two to Dover. We either published or will publish some statistics. A great number of honorees have done the English Channel, which is one of the iconic swims in the marathon world. But an incredible number also were unsuccessful for all sorts of reasons. Tell us a little bit about Jim's times in Dover.
Right. Jim was encouraged to do the English Channel by Jack Starrett. Jack, of course, had done it back in '64. He encouraged Jim to get, in training to do it. So Jim took it to heart. He arranged a swim in England, and he began his training, and he left for England in 1974. Towards the end, I think August, September. He got out there, and he had planned to do the swim on a neap tide, which is a lower low tide and a lower high tide. Less water in the channel equals less of a current and less of a distance to swim, and less of a sweep either way. But the neap tide, the week he got there, the weather conditions were horrendous. The boatman told him not to go. He'd never make it. And so he didn't go, but he practiced along the beach at Folkestone Harbor over there, 1 hour a day, just to keep himself limbered up. He didn't actually get into the water until the following week. I think the beginning of the following week, it became a spring tide, which is it's an outrageously different set of circumstances, because the spring tide, the earth and the moon and the sun line up, you get much higher high tides. And so you get much more of a sweep back and forth with the current as you're going across. So anyway, the swim started in Cap Grinet in France. Jim rode across 4 hours to France, turned around, got in the water, and started swimming back. And things were going okay, very well, even though there was a huge current taking him back and forth. But he's going straight ahead as far as he knew. And 11 and a half hours later, he ended up maybe 400 or 500 yards from the shore in England. And all of a sudden, the beach disappeared. He got swept. And his boatman says, you're going to have to take another 6 hours to get back to the position where you just were in front of the beach, tread water, and then swim back in. And Jim had been in the water 11 and a half hours, and he couldn't see himself staying another 6 hours. So he got out. He's very disappointed. Jack had made the swim. He didn't make the swim, but anyway, he went back a year later to try it again. And this time the conditions were much worse than they were the first time. He stayed in maybe 6 hours, but then had to get out. And as he pointed out later, it's not really the condition of the swimmer or who the swimmer is, it's the conditions in the water. that dictate whether you make that swim or you don't make it. I mean, there are many people that have gone over that and have not made it that could have made it and could make it. But you're at the mercy of the water conditions, the wind and the waves and the water, and the channel is very unforgiving. And I have to tip my hat to anybody who's ever made that swim. I'm sure Jim could have made it in correct conditions.
I have the statistics for you. There's 290 individual honorees in the Hall of Fame for marathon swimming.
Yeah.
130 have completed the English Channel. 22 attempted but did not complete. And the record was Jabez Wolf, who tried 22 times and never actually crossed the channel.
Oh my gosh.
I guess the other thing I would say to people is that there's this great teaching that goes into marathon swimming. And part of it is you never look up. Particularly if you're going towards France, the French cliffs look exactly the same 10 miles away as they do from 1 mile away. So
Right on.
psychologically, it doesn't help you. And when you look up and you see land 400 meters away, and then you look up again and it's further, it can be absolutely soul destroying. So the best advice is put your head down, swim until your hand hits something substantial, and then start talking about getting it out. Bob, one of the things that you talked about in your book, which now that I'm personally getting older, struck me as very poignant, is you talked about kind of being there for Jim's last swim. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, Jim getting older, going from his pioneering first ever swimmer, endless swims, to age catching up with him, and maybe that last swim that you remember.
Right. Well, Jim actually restarted the Boston Light Swim, which had gone out of existence in 1940 41 because of the war. And they said they were going to restart it afterwards, right after the war. But the war ended in 45 and it never started again until 1976. And the person who restarted it was Jim Doty. So he won that first race in 1976. I think there were 6 people in the race. In those days, it was hard to get a group together. He started again in 1977, and then in 78, he had formed a group, New England Marathon Swimming Association, and they sponsored it from 78 to the present day. But Jim completed 18 Boston Light swims, the record for that time, and then 5 relay swims. His last relay swim was 1999, the Boston Light. But in later years, up through the 2000s, Jim had a serious case of what they call edema, which made his leg twice the size that it should have been. And he still participated in mainly 1 mile swims in Boston. And towards the end, he had to limp in and then limp out again. He had, with the benefit of a cane, and he was really a shadow of his former self, but he did not want to quit water swimming. It was really so much into his system and into his blood that he just couldn't quit. But he did the last swim in 2010, July. It was called the Lodi Mile. Jay Lodi was a good friend of Jim's. After Jay died of cancer, Jim started that swim up. And then Jim participated in the 2010 swim. And then afterwards, I was down there just as the starter and taking photos, pardon me. After Jim completed the swim, slow, he got out and he, pardon me.
Grab a drink of water, Bob, if you want. We have time.
He got out of the water and he leaned up against one of the walls down there at L Street. and he's just looking out to sea. He's got his garb on. So I said, this will make a nice photo. So I took a photo of him from the side, and he's very pensive and almost like an introspective attitude, as if saying to himself, this is my last swim. I'm not going to be doing this again because I'm not up to it. And it was a really a sad moment, but he didn't seem to be sad. He just seemed to be ready to pass the torch. As you probably know, he passed away in April of 2012. And boy, when I heard that, and when every other member of the Boston Swimming Committee, swimming group heard that, we were stunned. We could not believe that the person who was the driving force of all of us out there, the encouragement he gave. You know, I swam the Boston Light once. I tried it 3 times. I completed it once, and it was Jim that said, you can do it. You can do it. You're 67 years old, but you can still do it. Train, train, train. And he encouraged and he encouraged everybody the same way. It was a huge loss when he disappeared. We used to go to swims, Gloucester, all over the Boston area. Invariably, we'd look for Jim. And invariably, he'd have a group around him, and he's holding court. Do this, do that, his experiences, and you know, nothing but encouragement came from him to everybody. And it was a sad day when he passed away. And,
So I guess one of the things I would tell people is when you go to one of these swims and you see a couple of older swimmers limping into the water, be a little bit cautious. You don't know where they've been and what they've done. And
Yeah.
Steve, I don't know if you're still on the line, but there's a great urban myth, it's true, about some guy going off to Hawaii, some great open water swimmer, and he was getting ready to get in the water, and some old guy was getting in with him. And he came out, and the old guy had just whooped him completely. And his name was, I can't do the last name, but it was Duke Kamanawano, who's the great Hawaiian swimmer of all times, who's still in his 70s, had a great turn of speed. And we had Otto Tanning at age 80, just complete Robben Island.
yeah.
So, Bob, I'd like to thank you very much. We'll put a cover picture of the book on the message that goes out. Is still available to folks. But thank you very much for capturing the career of this great swimmer and great contributor for the history of the sport. I really appreciate it.
It was all my pleasure, Ned, and thank you very much for having me on.